Well, I think it's appropriate to say Happy Resurrection Sunday. Don't you agree? What a wonderful job. Thank you, Jordan, and to our worship team and our choir that was here. And also thank you, Hayden, for such a wonderful word of introducing us to this celebratory day, the highest holy day of the year, Easter Sunday. If you've been here at Calvary, you know that we have been in a study with the Gospel of John, in the Gospel of John. And in John's Gospel, he organizes some of his key themes around what we call I am statements, statements that Jesus made about himself. And there's actually 7 I am statements that we'll find in the Gospel of John, and we've already been through 4 of them. So I'd like to start with the first 4, and then we're going to zero in on the 5th, that it will be our focus for today. But the first I am statement comes from John chapter 6, where Jesus declared, he says, I am the bread of life. That's the I am statement, the first one. And then there's always an explanation, a biblical explanation that follows. So here it is. For I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. In other words, our Jesus satisfies the deepest needs of our souls, satisfies our dry, parched souls, our hungry souls, and gives them nourishment. I am statement number 2 comes in John chapter 8, verse 12, where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And his explanation, or the biblical explanation that follows, says, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And in the Bible, darkness is always a metaphor for sin and for separation from God and for evil itself and the evil one. And Jesus has delivered us from that. He's brought us from the darkness into the light. The third I am statement comes in John chapter 10, where Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. And he continues by saying, I am the gate, and whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. In other words, Jesus is saying, I am the way to God. I am the only way to God. You must enter through me. I am the gate, and then you can come into God's sheepfold and be part of God's family. Find pasture for your souls. And then he follows that up with a similar I am statement. In John 10, verse 11, he says, I am the good shepherd. And then the scripture explains, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. And what he is saying is that he is the one who will protect us, care for us, full of grace and service, and even love us sacrificially. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then that sets the stage for the 5th I am statement, which comes in John chapter 11. And I invite you to turn to John chapter 11. This will be our focal passage for today. But in John chapter 11, verse 25, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. As it was said earlier, and Hayden actually read this passage from 1 Corinthians. Theologians believe, because Paul tells us, that if the resurrection did not happen, then our faith is useless. Our faith is futile, and we are lost. And we're lost without hope. He later says in that same context of 1 Corinthians 15, we might as well just eat, sleep, and be merry, because tomorrow we're going to die, and we're going to die without God, and we're going to die without hope. But the inverse is true, as she said. If it did happen, if the resurrection did happen, it authenticates everything that Jesus said and did. It gives meaning to all of these other I am statements. And so it's important that we understand what Jesus meant when he said, I am the resurrection and the life. The context for John chapter 11, the backstory, involves a very special friend of Jesus named Lazarus. And so let's join in the story with verse 1 of John chapter 11. It says, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now what we know here is that this was a very dear family that were very special friends of our Lord Jesus. He loved Lazarus, he loved Martha, and he loved Mary. But now he has received the very sobering news that Lazarus was sick, very sick. I don't know if you've ever received a word like that, where whether a family member or a close friend informs you that they are very sick. I remember when I received a phone call from a very good friend of mine named Billy Rogers. And he told me that he had just been diagnosed with liver cancer and the prognosis was not good. If you've been in that moment, and many of you have, you know it's just so sobering to try to wrap your heart and your mind around that news. Such sad, hard news to hear, but at the same time needing to encourage your friend and help your friend, join your friend to find faith in the midst of that trial in that moment. And so that's what I did when Billy called. You know, I met Billy when he was on the pastor search committee for First Baptist Church, Little Elm, Texas, and they wanted to meet with me. And I remember showing up for the first meeting. I was dressed to the T, coat and tie, and Billy was there in his blue jeans, tennis shoes, and white t-shirt. That was his M.O. And all of the guys on that team were just good old boys, country boys, living in a small town in North Texas with big city all around them. In Little Elm, Texas at the time, it was still a very small community. I don't think any of the guys on that committee, there were several women too, they impressed me, but the guys, I don't think any of them had an education beyond high school, but they were very intelligent, very street smart, and all of them were passionately in love with Jesus, but none more than Billy. And so through the process, Mona and I felt that God was calling us to go to Little Elm, Texas, to be their pastor as they were kind of going through this transition with the big city coming their way. So eventually I got to know Billy a little better. And so one day I asked him I said, Billy, can you just share your testimony with me? I've heard that in your younger days you were quite the rounder. And he said, Scott, that was an understatement. He said, if it was bad, I thought it was good. He said, if it was wrong, it was right for me. He said, I was doing everything that I shouldn't be doing. I was totally wild into the party scene, excessive drinking, excessive drugs. He said, I was involved in sexual indulgence of all kinds, all types. I was living for me, myself, and I, completely full of pride, completely full of self. He said, my marriage, young marriage, quickly ended. And then he said, I found the girl of my dreams, Dina. And the reason she was the girl of my dreams was because she could party as hard as I partied. And so he said, we connected, hooked up. Eventually we had children together and then thought it was a good idea maybe to get married. So we got married, but we were still partying. And then one day, Dina, on a Sunday morning, came to me and said, you know what, Billy? I think it's time we start taking our children to church. I'm going to take them to church this morning. Do you want to go? And Billy thought it was a joke. And he said, absolutely not. Sundays, he said, for me, were a day to drink a lot of beer and watch a lot of football and maybe squeeze in a few naps in between. That was what I was going to do. Absolutely not. Church was not for me. And I couldn't believe, he said, that it was for Dina. So she took the kids to church. He sat there in his recliner, got his beers going. A little too early for the football games. He was channel surfing, and all that was on the TV was religious programs. And then he came across Billy Graham. Of all people, Billy Graham was preaching one of his crusades. And he said he had heard about Billy Graham, and he actually had respect for Billy Graham, but he had never heard him preach. And for some strange reason, he did not change the channel. And he said, I kind of halfway listened at first, and then I kind of got drawn into the message, started listening more closely. And then he said at the end of the message, I can't explain it, but this wave of conviction came over me. And when Billy Graham gave an invitation for people to receive Jesus Christ and ask him to forgive them of their sins and become their Savior and their Lord, he said, I fell down on my knees, put my hands in my head in my recliner, tears coming down my face, and I asked for forgiveness, and I made Jesus my Lord and my Savior. Craziest thing, the most unexpected thing that I would ever do. He said, and then Dina came home from church with the kids. And Billy said, I told her what I had done and the decision I had made, and she thought it was a joke. She thought it was a joke. And then she said, after a couple of weeks living with this man that I did not know and did not like, I realized it wasn't a joke at all. It was the new Billy. And eventually, she began to come around. The Lord began to work in her heart, and eventually she said, I rededicated my life. I had become a believer as a child, but now, and it was real, but now I rededicated myself to the Lord. Billy and Dina started going to church. And as they started going to church, they began to be all in for Jesus, just like they were all in for partying. And he said, we started getting involved in everything we could. We started a praise team. When I was there, I remember starting a praise team, and they were like this. They just jumped right into the middle of it. Billy was the first to volunteer for the praise team, even though he could not carry a tune in a bucket. But he was a very expressive worshiper. And so we let Billy on the praise team. And eventually the church began to grow and more musically inclined people joined. And we transitioned Billy to other ministries like missions. We started a mission partnership with the Nobe Indians in Panama. And Billy went every single year, saved up his money, paid his own way, even paid for his entire family to go on numerous occasions. And eventually I appointed Billy to leadership on the mission field. And I remember one time we were on a trip where I took a team to one part of the jungle, in the Darien jungle. He took a team to the other part. And at the end, we came back together. And I remember meeting with him, and he was getting his team ready for the Jesus film. That was the big thing we would do at the end of the trip. But it was a problem. They were having bad weather, and I think they had some technical difficulties, and the team was tired. And they came up to Billy and said, Billy, can we just skip this tonight? And he said, absolutely not. We can't skip this. And he told them what to do, put a plan in place, and said, man, there's lives at stake here. And I remember just listening and watching Billy lead, and I said, wow, the student has become the teacher. Because I probably would have let him off the hook and said, no, you can just take the night off. No, Billy said, yes, we have to do it. What a great man of God. About a year after I had left Little M, Mona and I had been called to Arkadelphia, Arkansas, to Ouachita Baptist University. Billy called me up and said, I'm going to take my family on vacation. He came to Little M. And they went to Lake DeGray, bought their boat, and we had a time together. And then they went to church with us on Sunday morning. And after church, we had lunch. And then we gathered in the room to pray. And I remember asking Billy, I said, Billy, why don't you voice our prayer? We bowed our heads. We were holding hands. And it was silent for like 15 seconds, awkward silence. So I thought maybe Billy had not heard me, and I looked up, and there was Billy. His head was down, and he was just shaking his head like this, and I looked at his face, and he had this big, goofy grin across his face, and I knew that Billy was he was at the throne room. He was just taking it all in. And then he prayed the most heartfelt, beautiful prayer, thanking God for saving his soul, for giving him peace, hope, and life abundant. You know, I think my friend Billy and Jesus' friend Lazarus had a whole lot in common. And that is that both Billy and Lazarus loved Jesus passionately. And Jesus passionately loved them. But now he finds out that Lazarus is sick. Verse 4, when he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death." No, he says. It's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciple, "Let's go back to Judea." Now, when you read that verse 6, it says, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, we would expect that it would say that he immediately went to Lazarus to heal him. But it doesn't say that. It says he delayed. He stayed where he was for 2 more days because God had something that was even greater than healing in mind, something that would bring great glory to his name. Well, let me just summarize the next few verses, paragraphs. Jesus basically informs the disciples that Lazarus has gone to sleep. He's fallen asleep, and he's going there to wake him up. And the disciples said, "Well, good, Lord. If he rests, then maybe he'll get well." But then Jesus said, he spoke more plainly. He says, "What I'm really saying to you is that Lazarus has died. And we're going to go now to Judea." And they said, "Wait a minute, Lord. It's dangerous to go there. People are trying to kill you." And Jesus says, "We're going to go." We pick up the story in verse 17. It says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. Mary just didn't know Jesus was there. So he meets with Martha, and there was this large crowd. That's how they would come alongside a dear family in a time of loss and grief. Just like we do. They would gather, bring food, but in their culture, they stayed the entire week. We often come at the beginning and then come to the service, but they came for the entire week. So there was a lot of people there trying to bring comfort. And then when Jesus shows up, Martha comes to him, verse 21, and said to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now that's not really a rebuke. It was just a statement of fact. Lord, if you could have only been here, my brother would still be alive. But then she says, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." She knew that Jesus had all power. Perhaps he was going to do something special. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, "Martha, your brother will rise again." And then Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And then that's when Jesus says to her this "I am" statement. "Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this?" Verse 27, "Yes, Lord," she replied, "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After this, Martha goes and gets her sister, Mary. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The same thing Martha had said earlier. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. It's a very powerful language in words and expression in the Greek, the original Greek. In fact, some will say that it even has the tone that Jesus was angry. There was a spirit of indignation that was involved in his spirit that was deeply moved and troubled. What was he angry at? Well, what he was angry at was death. Man's mortal enemy. It was not God's original plan for mankind to die. You remember when death enters into the human experience, it entered in Genesis chapter 3 after Adam and Eve committed the first sin. And one of the consequences, one of the harshest consequences of that sin was death. Adam and Eve would die. All human beings coming after them would die. So he was angry at death, angry at the enemy, the agent of death, Satan himself, and angry that people have to go through such heartbreak and loss. There are some here today who are in the middle of grief. Some here today that this is your first Easter without your beloved mother or father or brother or sister or son or daughter or another beloved family member, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a niece or nephew, or a dear friend. Your first Easter without them, and you are in this time of grief and heartbreak and sadness and loss. What you need to know is Jesus is right there with you. He's on your side, by your side. He's for you. He's with you. And he's angry at what you're having to go through. Look what it says in verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, but one of the most profound. Jesus wept. He wept with Mary, with Martha, and with the other friends. Then verse 36, then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, cannot he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying? So some saw his compassion and admired him for his compassion. Others only blamed him for not being there. Jesus, once more deeply moved, verse 38 says, came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. And he said, take away the stone. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. His body is now in decay. Then Jesus said to her, did I not tell you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, he prayed a prayer, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me, letting them know that Jesus and the Father were together on this. They had a plan. They had a purpose. And he wanted the people to hear him pray and talk to the Father about the plan. And then, verse 43, when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And the man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Like a mummy, he walks out of that tomb. And then Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Set him free. Set him free from his own death and set his family and his friends free from their grief, their sadness, their pain, their heartbreak. Let it all go. And then we have this glorious result statement in verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. So how was Jesus glorified? He was glorified by believers like Mary and Martha and the disciples who witnessed this because their faith was greatly strengthened. But he was also glorified by those who were there who were not yet believers. And they saw this incredible miracle, mighty miracle, and they believed. And God was glorified. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. A few months after I received that phone call from Billy, we got word from some friends in Little Elm that time was short. So Mona and I got in our car and we drove to Little Elm, Texas. Came to Billy's house and walked inside and Where the recliner used to be, I think it was the same home where Jesus had given his heart to Jesus in that recliner. Now the recliner was gone, and in its place was a hospital bed. And next to that hospital bed was Dina's bed. And she was there by his side, taking care of him. And he was pretty heavily sedated. And so we spent a lot of time just trying to love on Dina and encourage her and catch up with the family and the community. And then Billy would wake up and we would talk a little bit. I remember we talked about one of our favorite stories. On one of the mission trips, this guy showed up. He was riding his motorcycle from Wisconsin all the way down to the tip of South America. Apparently that's a big thing to do. Had these fancy saddlebags, and Billy loved motorcycles. In fact, his dad had done the same trip when he was a young adult. And so Billy strikes up a conversation, invites him to sit down with us, starts hearing the guy's story. And after the guy told us what he was doing, he said, well, what are y'all doing? And he said, well, we're here on mission. We're working with the Nobe Indians, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the guy said, man, I've been trying to avoid missionaries my whole trip down. He said, what are you guys doing? You're trying to make them all into, leave them alone. Make them all into little Americans. You're going to put a McDonald's on every corner. And he just became very agitated, very offensive. I tried to calm him down and said, man, we've been invited here. We love their culture. We're just trying to help them reach their people for Christ. We're working with Nobe believers. He didn't matter. He didn't buy that. Finally, Billy gets frustrated. And he stands up and he says, dude, I don't know what kind of cartoon planet you're living on, but it's not this one. And with that, the guy storms off. And later, we talked about that, and I said, Billy, that's a kind of a unique witnessing strategy. I may have to borrow that someday. And so we reminisced about that while he's there, getting ready to go home to glory, and he laughed. And I said, Billy, I want to pray for you. And so we joined hands. I grabbed Billy's hand. And I start to pray. And he lifts up his other hand, praising God, full of joy, full of peace, full of hope. And he had that big, goofy grin across his face. Why? Why was that the case? Because he knew the resurrection. He knew the one who was life. And he knew the promise, the one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. My friend Billy is more alive today than he's ever been. The question, though, that this verse ends with is a very important one. Do you believe this? Billy believed it. I believe it. Do you believe it? We're going to have a time of invitation today, an opportunity for you to respond. And some of you are here, and the last thing you thought you would do is get saved. But today is your day of salvation. Not a better day than Easter Sunday. We want you to come forward. Don't worry about the crowd. It's between you and God. We want to just rally around you, support you, encourage you. If you're here today and you're not saved, today is your day. Do not miss it. It is a matter of life and death. Others are here, and it's time to rededicate your life to the Lord. And I want you to come forward too. There's something important about a public decision where there's just accountability, and it makes it a moment. It marks the moment. Come forward and rededicate your life. It's time. Time is of essence. Some of you are burdened for friends, family. Maybe you're dealing with somebody that's very, very sick. Maybe somebody that's not a believer. You might need to come to this altar and just pray, or come and let me pray for you. Some of you need to stand right where you're at and just pray and worship the Lord with all your heart. This is your time, You respond as the Lord leads. Let's stand and you respond.